The caves no one built. In 1992, a farmer in Zhejiang province, China, decided to drain a pond that had sat unused on his land for as long as anyone could remember. When the water was gone, he found a narrow opening in the rock beneath. He lowered himself in. What he found was not a natural cave, it was a carved chamber. Walls covered in precise parallel chisel marks, columns left standing to support the ceiling, floors cut flat, everything executed with a consistency that spoke of planning, skilled labor, and intention. When investigators drained the neighboring ponds, they found more. Then more again. Eventually, 24 separate underground chambers were identified in the same small area near the town of Xi'an in Zhejiang province, collectively covering more than 30,000 square meters of excavated space. Approximately 1 million cubic meters of rock had been removed to create them. No tool was left behind. No body was found. No historical record from any Chinese dynasty mentions their construction. Based on archaeological investigation and geological analysis, this is the story of the Longyou Caves, one of the most genuinely puzzling archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, and one of the least known outside China. The village of Xi'an sits in Zhejiang province in eastern China, in a landscape of low hills, rice paddies, and scattered ponds that have characterized this part of the Yangtze River Delta for centuries. In the summer of 1992, a local farmer named Wu Anai decided to drain one of the old ponds on his property using a water pump. The pond had no obvious natural inlet or outlet, which was unusual, and local tradition held that the ponds in this area were unusually deep, though no one had measured them. After 4 days of continuous pumping, the water level dropped enough to reveal a triangular opening in the rock at the pond's edge. Wu Anai entered the opening and found himself in a large chamber, carved, not natural, with walls bearing the systematic parallel grooves of chisel work and a ceiling supported by columns of untouched rock left in place during the excavation. The space was substantial enough that a person could stand upright and move around freely. He brought neighbors and local officials to see it. When investigators began draining the other ponds in the immediate area, they found the same thing beneath each one. By the time the survey was complete, 24 separate cave chambers had been identified within a roughly 1 square kilometer area. The caves do not connect to each other. Each has its own entrance, its own internal layout, and its own arrangement of rock pillars. But they share the same carved wall surface treatment, the same construction logic, and the same complete absence of any artifact, inscription, or organic material that might indicate when they were made, or by whom. The discovery was reported in Chinese media and attracted the attention of archaeologists from Zhejiang province and later from Chinese and international universities. Physical investigation of the chambers produced detailed documentation of the carving patterns and structural features. What it did not produce was an explanation. The most immediately striking feature of the Longyou cave interiors is the treatment of the wall and ceiling surfaces. Every exposed surface, walls, ceilings, the faces of the support columns, is covered with a pattern of parallel chisel marks arranged in consistent series at a roughly 60-degree angle to the horizontal. The marks are uniform in spacing, depth, and angle across enormous surface areas, with a regularity that researchers have compared to the surface finishing on modern machined stone. This consistency is technically demanding to achieve with hand tools. Maintaining a uniform chisel angle and stroke depth across thousands of square meters of irregular cave surface requires either extraordinary individual skill applied consistently over a long period, or a systematic method, perhaps a template or guide, that standardize the approach across multiple workers. Either possibility implies a level of craft organization and quality control that goes beyond simple functional excavation. The parallel mark pattern appears on surfaces that would have required working in awkward positions, overhead on ceilings, at ankle height on lower walls, around the curved bases of columns. The pattern does not vary with the difficulty of the surface. This suggests the treatment was not incidental to the excavation process, but was a deliberate finishing step applied after the structural excavation was complete, adding significant labor to a project that was already enormous in scale. Analysis by researchers from the Zhejiang Provincial Institute of Cultural Relics and Museums has documented the marking pattern in detail and confirmed that it does not correspond to any standard tool pattern associated with known Chinese stoneworking traditions from any historical period. The closest parallels identified are with certain types of surface finishing found in much earlier Neolithic contexts in the same region, but the correspondence is not close enough to establish a clear connection. What made the marks, and why, remains an open question in the published literature. The engineering scale of the Longyou Caves is best understood through a single number. Approximately 1 million cubic meters of rock was removed to create the 24 chambers. That volume of siltstone, the specific rock type of the Longyou Formation, weighs in excess of 2 million metric tons. It had to be quarried from the chambers, moved out through the entrance passages, and deposited somewhere in the surrounding landscape. No spoil heap corresponding to this volume has been identified in the vicinity of the caves. This is one of the more puzzling aspects of the Longyou mystery. The absence of the excavated material is not explained by any natural process. Rock removed from a cave does not disappear. It has to go somewhere. Survey of the surrounding area has not located a deposit matching the volume and composition of what was removed from the chambers. Several researchers have proposed that the stone was used as building material in construction projects in the region, which would explain its dispersal. But no specific construction project of sufficient scale to account for this volume has been identified nearby in the historical record. The labor calculation for removing this volume of rock by hand is substantial. Using conservative estimates for the productivity of hand tools in siltstone, removing 1 million cubic meters would require something on the order of 1 million person-days of work, roughly 3,000 people working for a year, or a smaller workforce working for longer. This scale of organized labor is not impossible for the period. The first emperor of China mobilized comparable workforces for wall construction and tomb building in roughly the same era. But it requires a level of social and economic organization that goes beyond what would be expected of an informal or private enterprise. The caves show no evidence of having been inhabited during their construction. There are no ash deposits from cooking fires, no food waste, no sleeping areas, none of the debris that accumulates when people live in a space over an extended period. The workers, whoever they were, did not live in what they were building. China has one of the most continuous written historical traditions of any civilization on Earth. The Shiji, Records of the Grand Historian, compiled by Sima Qian around 90 BC, covers Chinese history from the mythological period through the Han Dynasty in extensive detail. The dynastic histories that follow it maintain detailed records of government activities, construction projects, military campaigns, and economic data across 2,000 years of imperial rule. If a construction project involving millions of tons of rock and thousands of workers had been authorized by any Chinese government in the historical period, some record of it would be expected to survive. No such record has been found. Researchers have searched the dynastic histories, local gazetteers for the Zhejiang region, and temple and family records for any reference to the construction of underground chambers near Xi'an. The silence is complete. This absence is unusual enough to be significant. Large state construction projects in China were routinely documented, and the Longyou area was not remote or unimportant in the historical period. It was part of the territory of the state of Yue during the Warring States period, and later within the administrative reach of successive imperial governments. The absence of documentation has led to two broad categories of interpretation. The first holds that the caves were built during a pre-literate or early literate period, before systematic record-keeping had developed sufficiently to capture this kind of project, placing them in the Neolithic or early Bronze Age, before the periods covered by the dynastic histories. The second holds that the caves were deliberately kept secret for some purpose that required concealment, and that the records were either never made or were subsequently destroyed. The question of the cave's purpose is inseparable from the question of their builders, and both remain genuinely open in the scholarly literature. Several hypotheses have been proposed, each with some supporting logic, and each with significant evidential gaps. The military hypothesis holds that the caves were constructed as a hidden military installation, storage for supplies and weapons, shelter for troops, or a protected command facility for a regional power during one of the many periods of conflict that characterized Chinese history. The Warring States period, during which the state of Yue controlled the Zhejiang region, was a time of intensive fortification and military infrastructure construction across China. The cave's concealment beneath water, the pond surfaces would have hidden the entrances effectively, is consistent with a military logic of keeping strategic resources invisible to enemy reconnaissance. The storage hypothesis proposes a less dramatic but equally plausible function: the caves as a large-scale storage facility for grain or other commodities, taking advantage of the stable temperature and humidity of underground spaces in a region with hot, humid summers. Underground storage was practiced in China from early periods, and the scale of the Longyou facility would have been appropriate for the needs of a substantial regional population or administrative center. The water table management implied by the pond covers could have served to regulate humidity within the storage chambers. The ceremonial or religious hypothesis draws on parallels with other underground spaces in the ancient world that served ritual rather than practical functions. Hal Saflieni in Malta, various cave sanctuaries across Asia. The consistent surface treatment of the Longyou walls, which goes beyond functional necessity, could reflect an aesthetic or symbolic requirement. But no religious artifacts have been found inside the caves, and the specific symbolic system that might explain the wall treatment has not been identified. One of the less discussed but technically significant aspects of the Longyou Caves is the evidence they show of deliberate environmental management. The caves are carved in siltstone, a sedimentary rock with moderate structural strength and a significant tendency to absorb and retain water. The Zhejiang region receives substantial annual rainfall, and the water table in the area is high. Managing water infiltration in a large underground space in this environment requires either active drainage or a design that minimizes water accumulation. The pond water that filled the caves before their modern discovery was not groundwater slowly seeping in from all directions. It was surface water entering through the cave entrances, which were positioned at or near ground level, and therefore at or below the local water table when not actively managed. The cave's original users would have needed a system to keep the interiors dry, or would have designed the caves to function in a partially flooded state, or would have relied on active bailing or pumping to maintain usable conditions. Physical investigation of the cave floors has identified features that some researchers interpret as deliberate drainage channels, shallow grooves cut into the floor surfaces that would direct water toward collection points. If accurate, this interpretation implies that the builders anticipated the water management problem and engineered a solution into the cave design. The siltstone itself, while water-absorbent, has low permeability at the scale of the cave walls, which may have been a factor in the choice of this specific location for construction. The structural engineering of the caves is also notable. The rock pillars left in place during excavation are positioned at intervals that maintain ceiling stability across spans of several meters, in a pattern consistent with an understanding of load distribution in rock. The caves have remained structurally intact for what appears to be at least 2,000 years, despite the water-saturated environment, which is itself a demonstration of the effectiveness of the construction method. The parallel chisel mark pattern on the Longyou Cave walls has attracted attention not just as a technical puzzle, but as a potential carrier of information. Several researchers have proposed that the marks are not purely decorative or functional, but encode something, a system of notation, a record of the construction process, or a symbolic language specific to the builders. The basis for this proposal is the pattern's regularity. True decorative stone finishing in ancient contexts tends toward variety, different patterns in different areas, visual emphasis on particular surfaces, asymmetrical compositions that reflect human aesthetic judgment. The Longyou pattern is not like that. It is applied uniformly across every surface with the same angle, the same spacing, and the same apparent depth, regardless of location or viewing angle. That level of consistency, applied across such a large area, is more characteristic of systematic notation or process marking than of decoration. The specific angle of the marks, approximately 60 degrees to horizontal, has attracted attention because it appears consistently across all 24 chambers, despite the chambers having been excavated separately. If multiple teams of workers were responsible for different chambers, maintaining the same marking angle across all of them implies either a shared standard imposed by a central authority or a training tradition that transmitted the practice consistently across the workforce. No one has proposed a specific decoding of the marks that has been accepted by the research community. The pattern does not correspond to any known writing or notation system. Its informational content, if any, remains opaque. But the consistency itself is a kind of evidence. Evidence of a level of coordination and standardization in the construction process that adds to the picture of an organized, purposeful enterprise whose full logic has not yet been reconstructed. The decision to build underground rather than above ground was not a necessity imposed by the Longyou landscape. The Zhejiang region offers ample above-ground building space, and the siltstone bedrock required considerable effort to excavate. Building underground was a deliberate choice, and understanding that choice requires thinking about what underground space offers that surface construction does not. The most obvious advantage is concealment. Underground spaces are invisible from the surface, especially when their entrances are beneath water. Whatever was stored or housed in the Longyou Caves could not be observed, counted, or attacked by anyone who did not know the caves were there. In a period of chronic military conflict, and most of the plausible construction periods for the caves were such periods, concealment of strategically important resources had obvious value. A second advantage is environmental stability. Underground spaces maintain more consistent temperature and humidity than surface structures, which matters for the storage of organic materials. Grain, textiles, medicines, documents on organic substrates, all of these deteriorate faster in the variable conditions of surface storage than in the stable environment of a well-designed underground space. If the caves served a storage function, their underground location was not incidental to that function. A third possibility, less practical and more speculative, is that the underground location had symbolic or cosmological significance for the builders. Many ancient cultures associated underground spaces with particular spiritual meanings: the boundary between the living world and other realms, the domain of specific deities, or the appropriate location for activities requiring separation from the ordinary world. Chinese cosmological traditions from the relevant periods do not specifically mandate underground construction for any category of activity that the Longyou Caves clearly represent. But the symbolic dimension cannot be ruled out when no other explanation is fully satisfactory. The Longyou Caves have been the subject of ongoing investigation since their discovery in 1992, with involvement from Chinese provincial archaeological authorities, Zhejiang University, and researchers from other Chinese and international institutions. The site has received coverage from BBC documentaries and the Discovery Channel, which brought it to international attention beyond the specialist archaeological community. Despite this attention, the fundamental questions about the cave's date and purpose remain unresolved. Physical investigation has established several facts with reasonable confidence. The caves are entirely artificial. The siltstone formation at Longyou contains no natural caves, and every surface shows the marks of human excavation. The carving is ancient rather than recent. The surface patina and the biological encrustation on the walls are consistent with long-term exposure to the cave environment and inconsistent with recent fabrication. No metal tool fragments, wooden handles, or other excavation equipment have been found inside the caves, which is unusual but not inexplicable. A thorough cleanup before abandonment or a very long period of water submersion would account for the absence. Sediment analysis of material deposited on the cave floors during the period of water inundation has been conducted, but has not produced dating evidence precise enough to establish the construction period. The sediment postdates the construction, but the accumulation rate is too variable to provide a reliable timeline. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the area surrounding the known caves have identified potential additional subsurface features that may represent more caves or associated structures not yet investigated. The full extent of the underground complex may be larger than the 24 chambers currently documented. Investigation of these potential additional features has been limited by funding constraints and by the logistical challenges of working in an area with active agricultural use of the surface land. The Longyou Caves present a genuine archaeological mystery, not in the sense of requiring extraordinary explanations, but in the sense of a large, carefully executed, ancient construction project whose builders, date, and purpose have not been established by the evidence currently available. That is a real situation, uncommon in modern archaeology, where most significant sites have at least a partial historical context, and it is worth taking seriously on its own terms. The honest summary of what is known: the caves are ancient, artificial, large, and carefully made. They were constructed with organized labor at significant scale. They were subsequently flooded and forgotten, with no surviving record in any historical source. Modern investigation has documented them in detail without resolving the core questions. Further investigation is constrained by funding, access, and the limitations of available analytical methods applied to a site with no datable organic material in situ. What the Longyou Caves are not: evidence of a technologically advanced civilization beyond what the historical record shows for ancient China, proof of extraterrestrial assistance, or a site whose significance requires supernatural explanation. The carving technique, while impressive, is achievable with the iron tools that were available in China from at least the Warring States period. The structural engineering, while effective, applies principles of load distribution that ancient builders demonstrated repeatedly in other contexts. The scale, while large, is within the range of what documented Chinese state projects of the same era achieved.